everybody. It's my pleasure to invite you to this great talk about entities and beings in the psychedelic healing process. And today's speaker is coordinator of the Netherlands Psychedelic Society, and she is also interested in bridging psychedelics and cryptocurrencies. Is it okay?
Yeah.
To tell it? And of course, she has some university diplomas from whatever computer science.
Yeah.
Well, I think you can introduce all the degrees that you got yourself. But anyway, I think the most important thing is the contents of this talk, which perhaps you are wondering from the annotation on Facebook, even what it is going to be about. It's going to be a little bit more scientific, as far as we received feedback from the yesterday's talk in Prague. And as I already mentioned, the first part will be the lecture, then there will be the 15-minute break for beer and so on, and after that there will be the Q&A discussion of the various topics that will be covered in the talk and not covered in the talk. So that's it, and I give you the word, and you can start your great lecture.
Okay, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. Okay, so my name is Marta Kaczmarczyk, and I have a master's degree in cognitive science. I also did a postmaster's in user system interaction, which is sort of human-computer interaction. And then I worked as an academic for 1 year and researched persuasive science and technology. And also for my, kind of like as my hobby, I researched various modalities for like self-improvement, optimization. I've also like looked into like how our brain works and how we sort of like form our thoughts, like what's consciousness, and all that stuff. And the lecture is sort of like a mixture of all these things I've been interested in. So it is fairly scientific, but there's still like a lot of addition of Jungian psychology also. There's some of my own speculations there, stuff that came from my work as a psychedelic sitter, because I also offer a sort of like a service where I look after people who take psychedelic travels in the Netherlands, and the travels are legal there. So this is kind of like psychological phenomenon that came out from these sessions. I will start with the basic question. Psychedelic experience, what is it? And then, so maybe one of you would like to answer that question. Like, if you have like an idea, you feel that you're like confident about.
The death of your ego.
Okay.
Life in HD.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so, we only had like 2 answers, but like, I asked other people many times, and every person has different set of responses. And it looks like there's no kind of like common idea of like what is it exactly. So I started to look at this problem from the perspective of kind of like logical reasoning and scientific approach, because it seems like that everything has some sort of logical explanation. Whatever happens in our lives, it's sort of, there's like a logical mechanism behind it. And if we don't understand something, it just means that we haven't researched it properly. And then I started to think like, there must be a purpose of a psychedelic experience, so there must be something that we can sort of like use it to explain this. And then one of the things that came out this year was a paper from Imperial College where they compared near-death experience and psychedelic experience. And then they found that these two are nearly identical. So both share like the symptoms which are transcending one's body, entering an alternative realm, perceiving and communicating with beings, and there were deeds related to death and dying. So they sort of concluded that near-death experience and psychedelic experience is nearly the same thing. But the question is like, what is a near-death experience, and when do we experience this? And then I sort of look into like, okay, so when does it happen? When people go through near-death experience, and this happens when there's some danger that sort of shuts down our body, and usually it's like when we're sort of on the brink of the death, like for example our heart stops beating, but like our brain still works. So yeah, it's kind of like a situation where we're nearly dying, but we managed to come back, and so we remember everything. I looked into responses that happen when we die, when we face death, or like some other dangerous situation. And then in case of encountering a danger, we have 3 responses that we share with animal kingdom. And these responses are fight, flight, and freeze. And fight and flight are responses that happen in sort of less severe dangerous situations. So your sort of like whole human system, like your body scans the situation and decides there's like you're encountering a danger, and then it decides whether you can do something about this. So if your brain decides that like you can fight the situation, so for example you're attacked by someone, then it increases cortisol levels, adrenaline, and there's a blood flow to your hands and legs, so you can fight. And this is like an automatic response before you are conscious of this, so you can do it immediately and immediately prepare yourself for that situation. If your brain decides that you are not able to fight, then another response is flight. It's the same story, like increase in cortisol level, and then there's increase in blood flow into your legs, so you can immediately start to run away. But there are situations where you encounter dangers and it's completely hopeless. And then it's sure you're gonna either die or experience extreme pain or some extreme emotionally stressful situation. And the coping mechanism that happens there is called freeze response. And it means that your body shuts off. So your sensory information is not like it's sort of disconnected from your mind, and your thoughts are going inwards. So you stop perceiving the external environment, and then you sort of like travel inside. And when you think about this, this is probably similar to psychedelic experience, and this is what happens probably during like near-death experience, probably like extreme version of this freeze response. And I want to show you a video of the situation when it happens in animals. So this is like a video of
You need to move it to the second screen.
Oh yeah, sorry.
To the right.
So yeah, this is a video of antelope being attacked by leopard. And yeah, as you can see, the antelope looks like it's dead because it's not moving. It's like the sort of like the body doesn't respond at all. And there's a hyena approaching that scares the leopard. So the leopard decides to leave the antelope. So slowly after this happens, the envelope sort of goes out of that freeze response and starts breathing. And what's interesting here is that there's another sort of coping mechanism, like once the antelope experiences trauma, the animals, and we also share this, we remove the trauma by sort of releasing the stressful experience, and this happens by shaking it off. And you will see in a second how the antelope shakes off the horrible experience. And we, in our society, we completely suppress that.
So it's okay. Continue.
Okay. So we completely suppress that response. Yeah, I can't see my cursor here. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So yeah, we suppress that response, and so it looks like when we experience trauma, we don't release it from our bodies and we store it. And then I will discuss the implications of this a bit later. Because I have to explain to you also like what's trauma, because a lot of people have misconception on what's trauma. Like many people think that trauma is some kind of like a violent event that happened in the past. Some people connect it to physical abuse, for example, people understand it's like being at war as a soldier, it's traumatic experience. But we also have to remember there's a psychological trauma, and being exposed to continuous neglect or emotional abuse is also a traumatic experience. And to some degree, majority of us have some traumatic experience stored in our bodies, because we all sort of live in a society that puts a lot of pressure on us, and in a way we all, like, well, maybe not all, but majority of us experience some kind of neglect or like conditional love, like push for achievements. Traumas can be experienced on different levels of our lives. And studies from Brno, for example, discovered that we can already have a prenatal trauma, which happens if a woman in pregnancy experiences some pain and she releases some chemicals that cause a stress on the baby in the belly. There's a birth trauma that we all have, and then we can experience more traumas later in our life. This is a quote by Peter Levin. He's a founder of somatic experiencing. It's one of the most effective somatic therapies nowadays. And he says that actually trauma, it's not something that happened in your past, it's what you did with that event. So if you never process that event psychologically, or if you never release it through your body, so you didn't shake it off, you have the trauma stored in your body. So he calls it that these are like residual energies that are not discharged from our bodies. And they're trapped in our nervous system, and they wreak havoc on our bodies and minds. And the result of storing these traumatic experiences is, in many cases, post-traumatic stress disorder, or sometimes if we experience like prolonged trauma, then it's a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And here are the main symptoms of the PTSD, so the post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the most interesting for me is the spaciness and episodes of dissociation. And the dissociation is sort of like this freeze response. So it looks like people who experience trauma, who have PTSD or complex PTSD, in many cases they enter that state of freeze response. It obviously like varies in a sort of gradient. So like they're not grounded in reality, they sort of run away, and it can be in form of like daydreaming or inability to focus, or is like a disconnection from your body too. So this is this kind of like shows that if we repeated that dissociated state, if we enter that dissociated state of freeze response in the childhood, because the brain is more plastic when we're small, and if we repeat it, this becomes like a maladaptive trait that we carry on to our adulthood, and we are not even conscious of this. And also, if we have some form of PTSD or complex PTSD, then not all life-threatening situations can trigger us to that dissociated response, to that freeze response. So situations that resemble situations that led us to that trauma that can cause us to dissociate. And that also like varies in degree. Some people just like zone out and are not able to stay in the present. For some people, it's more serious, and they become immobilized, and they are not able to control their bodies. And what's interesting is that many people who take psychedelics, they actually experience trembling, either during the psychedelic experience or immediately after, and it's pretty common in ayahuasca drinkers. So it looks like it's a sort of like another confirmation that psychedelic experience might be that freeze response, and that enables you to sort of immediately remove that trauma. So it sort of opens you to that trauma, and you can shake it off. And here is a quote of the person that said, like, I did Aya one time, and at the end of the trip I started shaking, and it wasn't conscious, but it felt like it was pretty pleasant. So the question is like, do psychedelics enable a controlled freeze experience? And another sort of confirmation that this might be true is shamanic rituals, where shaman on intent tries to like disturb our nervous system. So by drumming, for example, monotonous continuous drumming, you overwhelm the vestibular system, so your nervous system in your ear, and then it leads to shutdown of the temporal parietal junction, a part of the brain, and then also shuts down your sensory system. So it looks like the freeze response is a coping mechanism. It's like a protective measure, so you avoid sort of like overwhelming your nervous system and damaging your nervous system. And people discovered that you can actually go in that state on purpose, and kind of like there are ways to have a controlled freeze response, and like shamanic ritual or psychedelic experience seems to be one of those methods. And other methods are, for example, also like hyperventilation that's like practiced by many mystics in the East. So coming to the topic of the talk, entities. How many of you have had an experience with entities? Okay, so it sort of looks like 20%. Okay, so entities are sort of like characters that people encounter in their psychedelic experience that seem to be independent from them and have like a separate agenda and their separate agency from the person that goes through the psychedelic experience. And in many cases, entities communicate some knowledge that is very personal, or some truths about how the universe works, or stuff about your past and stuff like that. And in scientific terms, those entities are called eidetic hallucinations. And eidetic means that they're nearly the same as reality. They're like they seem to have like this photographic or animated film-like clarity. And sometimes those hallucinations become concrete hallucinations, which means that they seem to be more real than reality itself. And scientists found that the concrete hallucinations are shared. They exist not only in psychedelic experience, but also in lucid dreaming and sleepwalking and in dementia. If psychedelic experience is a freeze response, then obviously entities are part of that freeze response too. And so it looks like there must be some kind of like response that we probably learned as children. And so I started to like dig into what's dissociation, and I looked into like its most extreme version, which happens in a dissociative disorder, because I wanted to understand like what happens, why there are entities, and why for some people they seem that there's like a part that they encounter that's not them in the psychedelic experience. So in the dissociative disorder, it looks like people who have that, they have a feeling that, well, they kind of divide their personality into alternate identities. So they not like a unified person, integrated person, but they have like different alternate identities. And there's a theory behind it that this happens because, again, it's like a sort of coping mechanism and another protection of the nervous system, and that instead of experiencing a trauma as a one person, if the trauma is like very large and happens on a continuous basis, then you kind of like divide yourself into parts, and then each part experiences different parts of trauma. So it's kind of like shared between different identities. So it's sort of like there's less damage on your nervous system thanks to it. But then obviously it is a problem for a person because then you have a dissociative disorder. And this is like, this says that dissociative processes, they sort of happen, they're not always pathological, and there's like a survival related context behind them. So there's like a purpose. When there's too much pain, then you kind of start to dissociate from it. In like therapeutic context, there are different names for those alternate identities, and they include like personalities, different self states, parts of selves, and one of them is also entities. So I started to think that maybe entities we encounter in the psychedelic experience, maybe there's a similar mechanism happening. So many people sort of when they go through psychedelic experience, and especially if it's like a strong substance, they seem to be facing some trauma, and maybe they sometimes not ready to face whatever that's happening, and they have to sort of divide their identity into parts, so they're able to come up from the experience undamaged. And that's why they sort of see some kind of alternate identity that talks to them instead of kind of like going through this on themselves. And it sort of doesn't mean like it doesn't diminish the experience itself. It's like the experience itself, it can be still beautiful, and the entity's message can be full of love or unconditional love. Like many people have different things that they cannot cope with. So, for example, if you grew up as a person that never had very little of unconditional love in your life, and you suddenly experience this flow of unconditional love during the psychedelic experience, maybe you're not able to cope with it. Maybe there will be too much. That's why you have to create those entities that will show you the message, and that it's easier for you to digest. I also looked into the concept of identities from the neurological and neuroscientific perspective, and there are some main mechanisms happening in the psychedelic experience, and they all sort of related to creation of a chaos in the brain. So the proper name for this is entropic brain. So it seems like some control centers in your brain are disinhibited, and that leads to cortical desynchronization. So your brain parts, they oscillate at some frequencies, and then the whole brain is kind of synchronized. And when you ingest a psychedelic, then the synchronization kind of is disrupted. And also there's a disruption between, we normally have a balance of inhibitory and excitatory neurons. And if you ingest psychedelic, there's a disruption of that balance. Probably there's some conflict, disinhibition of inhibitory neurons. And for some reason that leads to enhancement of autobiographical recollection. And there's a theory that the reason for this is that because your control centers are disinhibited, then you kind of go into more archaic cognitive cognition. So you use more animal-like thinking, and so then you go back to your sort of childhood, where your ego structures weren't fully developed, and then so your brain sort of sort of sends you back to your past when you were small and you had the same type of thinking, and then you can sort of relive your past. But also, it doesn't happen automatically. You sort of have to make an intention that you want to do it. So you kind of have to guide your brain, you kind of have to say, I want to relive my past, and that, this desynchronized brain, archaic cognition brain, sort of can take you there. So this inhibition is happens in majority of parts of our brains. And it also happens in our visual cortex, which is the part of brain responsible for processing visual information. There's a mathematical model of how the visual hallucinations happen by Cohen and Ermentrout. And they say that ingestion of a hallucinogen causes instability in V1 area. And they think that the neurons that are responsible for creation of contours and edges are disturbed, and then they create images sort of like here. So kind of fractal structures. There's another theory that relates to synchronization. So that was put forward by James L. Kent, who wrote Psychedelic Information Theory. And he says that we have a refresh rate of how we see images. So we don't see continuously, we don't see continuous sort of images, just images stuck on top of each other. It's in film or TV works the same way. So the images just stuck on each other, and there's like a refresh rate that happens so fast that we see it as a continuous vision. So he thinks that psychedelics disrupt that refresh rate. It either, depending on the substance, they either slow it down or make it faster. And the result is kind of like creates like a sensory echo effect or complex brain interference patterns. And he did some experiments with videos where he stacked images on top of each other and then changed the refresh rates. And as you can see, some of these images, especially like the one here with the hand, resembles something we see during the psychedelic experience. So another thing that could explain like changes in our visual information processing during the psychedelic experience is the predictive brain theory. This theory says that brain is a sort of like a prediction machine. It's kind of like you take some information from the outside through your senses, and then your brain kind of decides what to do with this information, and then like predicts the next action. And then you get another feedback from the outside through sensory input, and then you see whether your action was kind of congruent with that feedback from the outside. And then you have, as a result, you have like a prediction error. And the purpose of sort of like a cognition is to like minimize the prediction error. So you kind of like, for example, as a baby, you learn how to like move your hand and like reach for the object. So you kind of like, by moving your hand and getting a feedback from the outside, you're diminishing your like diminishing the prediction error. After eventually you sort of it's very small. And there's a theory that kind of like the psychedelics might disrupt that prediction model. And it's possible that it's sort of the similar stuff is happening as in sleep. There's a theory that sleep sort of like we have a kind of like a virtual reality generator in our heads, and while like during like our everyday awake state, we sort of like engage with the outside to kind of update the prediction error, sort of to get a feedback, live feedback on our prediction. Then the state of sleeping is kind of like a virtual reality space where you can refine your prediction error by with no risk, but kind of like just being in sort of like a virtual space. And it's possible that psychedelic experience enables you to do the same, but it's like more like a lucid dream where you actually can engage. So then what it means, because it's controlled and lucid, then you can actually make your prediction error either smaller or higher, depending like what's your intention. And that's why if you sort of enter your psychedelic experience with the wrong intention, you might actually disrupt your prediction error and make it worse. And it's possible also that kind of like if you disrupt that prediction error, you increase that prediction error during the psychedelic experience, then you increase the number of noise in your brain, and then you sort of receive strange information during psychedelic experience that kind of like information that's not relevant to your life. It might be relevant to you on a personal level, might be kind of meaningful, but for example, there's like no relation to it in the outcome, so like the feedback you get from the outside is not necessarily kind of congruent with what you learned there. And there, if that happens, then on a personal level, maybe if you're like fine and you're able to like live with it happily, and you kind of like I don't know, like you create this like world for you where it doesn't matter, it's fine. But there are risks of this, so I looked into like dissociation in light of predictive brain theory, and if you disrupt that prediction error, then you are risking destabilizing your brain. And then one of the effects could be hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. That's a disorder when you still see some visual disruptions after psychedelic experience is long over. And people kind of like experience some trails or moving or breathing objects. It seems like that this is more common than we think. There was a scientist named Bagot, and they did an online questionnaire, and they found that 61% of respondents of this questionnaire reported some form of hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. And persisting, it means that it continues, it's a continuous action. So it happens all the time. It's not like you sometimes see traits, but on a continuous basis you have destabilized vision. And 24% people from that questionnaire reported this on a constant or near constant basis, and 4% of people actually sought treatment. And there's a question why only this low amount of people sought treatment. And it's possible that people kind of create like a personal philosophy around this, because psychedelic experience is connected to like a mystical experience, and there's like a big philosophical framework around it, and people connected with religion. So maybe people who experience this, maybe they think it's sort of like another step in spiritual process. And maybe they think it's sort of like another step to being enlightened, or something like that, and they don't report that because it's not disturbing their life that much, and maybe that's they decide it's fine. Also, like those values that are shown here, they might be way exaggerated, because it's possible that people who decide to take part in a questionnaire, they went to like fill it in because they actually had some hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Though like Robin Carhart Harris and David Nutt, they did a similar questionnaire, and they found that 40% of people, respondents, experienced that disorder too. So it's definitely something that's we should be like thinking about, because it seems like that the side effect is pretty severe. So another thing that kind of might result from the disturbed prediction system and increased prediction error is depersonalization disorder. And it's very similar to hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, but this affects our cognition in general, and DSM classified this as a dissociative disorder. So it looks like people who have the personalization, they're sort of stuck in this freeze response. So maybe someone who used that freeze response in a childhood, they ingested psychedelic, and now it's in a way they're re-traumatized, and they don't know how to get out of that freeze response, and they just stuck in it. And depersonalization means that whatever you experience doesn't feel real anymore, and you feel like you're in a dream more than in reality, and you're disconnected from your body. So these are like the main symptoms of this disorder. So one is like detached from body, from mental processes. Other people seem to be machine-like or unfamiliar. It's pretty actually common that this happens after psychedelic experience, and there are even forums on Facebook and on the internet where people kind of like seek treatment for this. And this is a quote from one of the users of psychedelics that had the depersonalization, and what's actually worse is that some people try to treat themselves with taking more psychedelics, which is a terrible idea because it's against the dissociative experience, so you're becoming even more dissociated. And yeah, as you can see in this quote, this person says, everything feels dreamy and unreal, and it's challenging for me to accept it for some reason. I actually plan to trip this weekend, hoping it will get me back into the groove and break this awful pattern I've been stuck in. Maybe it could only make things worse. But even though he thinks maybe it's going to be worse, I'm going to try to take more psychedelics. This is like a kind of like a pyramid that shows all those like responses and that I talked about, like the coping mechanisms, and where like how we can use psychedelics to sort of navigate through those responses and how to bring ourselves into the bottom where I guess like we all would like to be, which is like a social engagement in living out of joy and being grounded in our bodies. And I think that because psychedelics offer a controlled freeze response, if they are done with like a person, with like a therapist, or in the context of kind of like healing yourself and knowing that this is a controlled dissociation, controlled freeze response, you can actually release yourself from PTSD, and you can kind of decide that you don't need that response anymore, and then you start deactivate that freeze response and then go down into fight and flight, which is also not something that you want to have, but it's more beneficial because, as you can, I'm not sure whether you can see, but like the freeze response is characterized by the statement "I can't," and this is like a depression, helplessness. And the state of fight and flight is a state of I can. So that's easier to navigate for you, even if you're still governed by stress, and it's still, you can have like high anxiety rates or anger and frustration. It's sort of easier to deactivate that state because you can sort of like do cognitive behavior therapy then. So like expose yourself to stressful situations and then use either like microdosing, for example, or like breathing techniques, or like some kind of like techniques that calm you down and send a message to your brain that you're safe, and then those responses are turned off. I guess like in therapy, the biggest challenge is to get a person out of that freeze response, and I believe that psychedelics can actually help us by being a controlled dissociated state. So to conclude, if you have like a really encounter with the entity, maybe it's the idea to sort of like reevaluate this experience from the perspective of like what happened during that experience, and maybe it's a sign that you have some sort of traumas you have to go through, and maybe you should like take it easier. Also, like don't take high doses of psychedelics that put you into like the encounter with the entity. And also, like I don't mean here that like those experiences are not valuable or like should be discredited. It's kind of like they should be sort of maybe looked from other perspectives also. Like maybe you shouldn't believe like 100% that whatever happened was true or something like that. Maybe you kind of could like reevaluate it. And as I said, like before, the controlled freeze may be one of the best and most effective tools of deactivation of the freeze response. And definitely there's more studies needed on psychedelics and depersonalization and dissociation, on the link between all those responses. And many facilitators nowadays because there's no conduct. It's all like either like clinical trials, and you have to be a patient, or like go through like some academic research project to get like a proper sitter or a therapist to guide you through a psychedelic experience, or you either go to someone who does it like either illegally or semi-illegally. And many facilitators of psychedelic experiences, they have no idea about depersonalization or dissociation, and this is a bit worrying. There's a point here that sort of like yesterday in Prague we discussed, like people have a problem with this a little bit because many shamans don't talk about depersonalization or dissociation, and this is because they sort of the framework they use comes from a different cultural background, and they don't understand our traumas, and they don't understand that we are so disconnected. Like majority of them, their cultural framework is based in the idea that they all understand that we are connected to our external environment and to ourselves and to our bodies. They struggle with understanding we're so disconnected from our bodies even. So it's possible that they actually don't even know that this might happen to you. Shamanic experience is also valuable, and they have like a different ways of talking about this, and many of them can help you, but they won't use the same language. So there's a sort of a risk of being lost in translation. And while the shaman might have like a good intention, and whatever he does, it's like valuable, but you might not understand it and end up depersonalized as a result if you go through experience like this. There's also like a need of discussing more grounding techniques in our community, because it's important after a person dissociated. It's always valuable to at least do some breathing exercises or some kind of like advise a person to engage in some yoga or some body form of like ways of connecting back to your body, because many people actually get depersonalized, and sometimes maybe it's like not severe depersonalization, so you might even not notice this. And I feel like we should start to discuss the shadow side of psychedelics more, because at the moment there's like a tendency to angelize psychedelic experience because we all want to decriminalize those substances or like maybe make them legal. But I guess if we want to do it, we should show to the rest of the society that we're a responsible community, and we know that there are some side effects and dangers, and that we're thinking about this, and we're looking for ways to kind of counter actions for all those risks. And the last thing I'm going to say, it's a project I just started where it's like a blog and consultation service, and I'm going to write on this blog about the shadow side of psychedelics, and about different methods of removing fight and flight responses and dealing with dissociation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk, and let's have a 15-minute break for having some refreshment, and then we will do the discussion of all the things that you have prepared in your mind.